Welcome to The Point, coming to you from Sanya, southern China's Hainan province. Now, the world's oceans are facing growing pressure from competing territorial claims, from overlapping maritime zones, from the competition for resources, from climate change effects, and of course, under the rivalry of major countries around the world. Yet, there are meaningful examples of how countries have to manage their differences, even resolve their disputes through a mix of ways, such as legal means, such as political means, such as practical cooperation. What are some of the efforts that are going on? What can be done better? Welcome to the second half of a special program on managing maritime disputes, regional practices and international experience. Let's come back to our panel of guests. Hu Bo, Director of the Center for Maritime Strategy Studies of China's Peking University. Philip Saunders, Dean Emeritus and Adjunct Professor of Schulich School of Law of Canada's Dalhousie University. Vladislav Tolstych, Professor and Head of International Law Section at the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Ruhanas Harun, Professor of International Relations, Security and Law at the National Defense University of Malaysia. Admiral Shekhar Singha, member of the Governing Council of the Indian Council of World Affairs and of the Executive Committee of the Global Council of Counterterrorism. Hong Nong, Executive Director of the Institute for China-America Studies. Zhao Long, Deputy Director of the Senior Fellow of the Institute for International Strategic and Security Studies at Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. A big round of applause to all of our panelists. Professor Hu Bo, let me come back to you. Now, we've already talked about, the legal pillar, the political negotiation, and the practical cooperation. In terms of China, some people would say, what do you regard as the UNCLOS, the legal pillar? Why is China so adamant not go through this path in terms of using litigation, arbitration to resolving the South China Sea issue?
Okay, I think China has never said that we don't want to go to the arbitration or ICJ or ITLOS. The base is that the arbitration ruling raised by Philippines is not our case. China didn't participate. That's one thing. The other thing is that the Philippines case, I think the context of the Philippines case has beyond the authority of UNCLOS as well as that arbitration. So that's why I think China doesn't accept the arbitration ruling of the case raised by Philippines. I think China is open bilaterally, multilaterally, and also some legal procedures. But one principle is very clear. We are living in the sovereign state system. China should agree. If we agree, I think we can accept the result. As to South China Sea disputes, I think the public and the people, even some officers, you are over-focused on South China Sea. There are other maritime disputes worldwide, but nobody cares because China is related to the South China Sea disputes. So the international public focus on the South China Sea disputes, then you will find the tension is very high. But actually, if I can raise the points to the situation of the South China Sea and to the managing the disputes of South China Sea, I can give maybe 17 points. 17 points, not too high, but not too
bad.
Yeah, not too bad.
Not too bad. I'll use this opportunity to try to get answer from our Malaysian panelist because she was talking about the ASEAN way. What is your understanding of China's perception of the ASEAN way? Could the ASEAN way be the ASEAN-China way?
I think China 100% support the ASEAN way. I think China is, the number one major power that supports the ASEAN way. Many Western told me like that, you are just wasting time. For 20 years or 30 years, you got nothing. But in ASEAN way, the process is most important in the result.
The process.
Process, and is most important. If we are in the process of negotiation, consultation such as the COC, consultation, which means that no party wants to go to the war, wants to use force to settle the disputes. That's a good thing. I think international community should praise that and encourage this kind of dialogue.
Why is it taking so long? What is the problem? Is it China's problem? Or
Now, everything, in the COC connotation, every article should be accepted by 11 parties. It is not a China ASEAN mechanism. It is China and 10 ASEAN member states, plus 10, now 11. So that's a very difficult procedure. So we should be patient, and we should be confident that even we couldn't get a result in the foreseeable future, I think the process itself has the value.
the process itself has value. Okay, let's go to Professor Saunders. Again, if you don't mind, we stay with the UNCLOS tool. If UNCLOS, or how it is interpreted, is not the most suitable approach to resolving territorial disputes, what can we use the UNCLOS to do, really? Maybe to jumpstart some kind of cooperation, to mitigate some of the negative consequences of these disputes, and in other words, to manage. Are there other ways we can cite the law?
Well, we talk about the time. I grew up near an island just a few dozen kilometers away that's been subject to a territorial dispute and an associated maritime boundary dispute since 1783 between Canada and the United States. It still is, and we get by. We'll settle it someday. So the time frame I wouldn't worry about that much, as long as things can be managed. But UNCLOS does allow for the management. It's not opting first for the dispute resolution in the formal legal sense. And I think the problem with the South China Sea arbitration was that UNCLOS actually had built into it exemptions which states could sign up for, saying we exempt ourselves out for maritime boundaries. We don't want that to be mandatory for dispute settlement of the formal type. And China had signed up for that as it was entitled to. I think, it's my opinion, others would disagree, but my view is that the tribunal essentially ignored that exemption and that entitlement and found ways around it, and that's very dangerous for the dispute settlement provisions in UNCLOS. The other parts of UNCLOS that are still available and help, in a sense, in the South China Sea is that it does encourage regional cooperation. And regional cooperation seems to be the way that a lot of things are going. I think back to other things that have already been talked about that have been done as part of the practical cooperation. It takes place in other informal ways too. For the National Institute for South China Sea Studies had for a number of years been conducting training courses for civil servants from around the region in sort of neutral marine management courses. That in itself is a way of building confidence. People get to know each other. There are avenues of cooperation. I've taught on some of those myself. They're excellent. Those are the sorts of things that can still go on under UNCLOS. Regional fisheries management organizations, those have been mentioned. They have to be built very carefully. All of those things are still possible under UNCLOS if you don't default to formal dispute settlement.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Let me go to the Arctic region and go to Mr. Toy's archive. The relationship between Russia and the West has not been the best in the world, and yet it seems that you have been able to compartmentalize your geopolitical confrontation with the potential for cooperation in the Arctic region. Is that the case? If that is the case, how have you been able to do that, first of all? Secondly, this asymmetry between major country and smaller countries, is that also an issue when it comes to managing the maritime disputes between Russia and some of the other claimant states in the Arctic?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, you're right that the level of cooperation of Arctic states is quite high, and the cooperation within the Arctic Council was not suspended due to the conflict in Ukraine. The Arctic states concluded several regional agreements. They concluded several agreements on delimitations, 4 of them submitted application to the Commission on the limit of the continental shelf, and recently the United States recognized the customary nature of the Article 76 of the Convention. But I would say that there are some tensions or even some sleeping conflicts or dormant conflicts. So the situation is not easy. For example, the United States and Canada did not delimit their shelf. They started negotiations only a year ago. There were overlapping claims to the shelf around the pole. Then I would say that we concluded with the United States an agreement on the delimitations, but the agreement was concluded under the terms of provisional application. And recently, there have been some proposals to withdraw from the agreement and to insist on the line of equidistance. And from legal point of view, it's very interesting is if Russia is prevented to withdraw from the agreement by virtue of the principle of estoppel. It's not clear, I mean. And the most important thing, I think, that legal rhetoric used by the Arctic states is very different. And states protest against argument advanced by other states. For example, the United States protested against the regime of navigation in the Northern Sea route in 2015, and recently Russia protested against the unilateral announcement of outer limits of the shelf by the United States. It was 2 years ago, referring to non-compliance with the procedure within the Commission. So the conclusion is that situation is very interesting from the point of view, and I would agree that we need both legal argumentation, the development of legal argument and political cooperation. Thank you.
In terms of the asymmetry, you want to address that point, or you have already done?
Yeah, asymmetry of power, it works, shows that security consideration and consideration based on force play a very important role in the Arctic. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the Arctic is partially excluded from the general law of the sea, because of the Article 234, because of some customary regulations. So yeah, you are right. The asymmetry in political relations plays a very important role, and sometimes it excludes the application of rules of general international law.
Yeah, Professor Harun, let me come to you. You said quiet diplomacy. That term actually struck me. And it's my impression that China is also very interested in the quiet diplomacy. You know, countries come together. That's precisely what the DOC is all about. You know, let us take care of our business together among ourselves, by ourselves, for ourselves. And yet it seems that it's not possible because always there are external players who want to insert themselves into the process. How do you look at that?
Yeah, thank you. When I say quiet diplomacy, it is to say that the opposite would be, fighting or barking, loudly at each other. But in ASEAN, for example, we'd rather talk quietly, find consensus, because there are issues that you cannot publicly, openly, tell the world. So you have to agree at this sort of the elite level, and then say, okay, this is what we are going to tell the press and our public. And coming from Malaysia, which is, well, I would say is a democratic country, small country, I think the government has to be very careful, because when you talk about international relations or, telling the world what the policy is vis-a-vis an external issue, you have to take into consideration the domestic opinion. In Malaysia, for example, I have not come across one external issue where there is a consensus in the public. So we try to negotiate first and reconcile what the country should present to the world its views. The same thing on South China Sea. So with South China Sea, one of the groups that would be consulted would be the Navy. If the Navy says, oh, there's no point, fighting the Chinese, harassing or attacking them. Why? Because the Malaysian Navy is quite small, and we do not have that capacity to sort of sustain a war conflict with China. People have accused Malaysia, why are you so tolerant about China? Well, this is part of that quiet diplomacy. Of course, we value relationship with China for many reasons. But the other thing is the reality of it. You talk to the Navy, they will admit that we do not have that capacity. So the best thing is to talk, to persuade, this kind of diplomacy. I think that's
in the process of the DLC consultations, do Malaysia or other countries in ASEAN feel the pressure of China to accept what China imposes on them? Or is it a democratic process?
Well, I think the pressure comes not just from China, but from all sides. I think in ASEAN, many countries, if you ask, is China a threat or an opportunity, they will say, well, there's more opportunity. So there is less pressure, there is more pressure on these countries to maintain good relationship with China. So if you want to call that pressure, well, that is a pressure. So they work on it. We make efforts. The other pressure is, of course, from the United States. I mean, the United States has been in Southeast Asia since the end of World War II. It has been a dominant power, very prominent in Southeast Asia. The US has had alliances with countries in the region, but nobody raised that issue. So when you try to be nice, friendly with China, people immediately say, oh, why are you now being nice to China? But you never asked us. We have been so nice to Australia, to Japan, to the United States. See, this is, I think it's a dilemma of sorts for ASEAN. Yeah.
Well understood, I understand. Thank you so much for your honest feedback. Very interesting situation. Let me turn to Admiral Singha. In terms of what's happening in this part of the world, do you think there are mechanisms that are working? If not, what's missing from an observer's point of view?
Thank you for that question. If you say, is there any mechanism to solve these problems in the region?
To manage?
Yeah, short answer is no. There is no mechanism. By and large, everybody has trust on the UNCLOS. Bilateral talks are the best thing to do. And I would say, as far as those disputes are concerned, the Indian Ocean region is largely peaceful. The second point is that there is no way to enforce these laws. There is no way to enforce these verdicts. How do you enforce it? At sea is quite difficult. And there is no mechanism, there is no sort of body that, somebody is violating and therefore you should catch hold of him, and this is what is happening in the IUU. So I think that maritime is a little bit fluid as far as the laws are concerned. If you respect the UNCLOS, you follow it.
I think there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And I don't think it's a an issue between about the big countries, small countries, and we have to look at the regional context. If you allow me to be a bit more ambitious to cover a few regions that I'm researching on. For instance, we're talking about the Arctic, which have been elaborated already quite by several speakers. They are taking a dual approach. On the one hand, they're doing their delimitation or sovereignty like Canada and France. They solve the issue of Hans Island quietly. And then on the one hand, they're taking bilateral negotiation approach. On the other hand, they refer to the CLCS to determine the outer limits of Canadian shelf. So both ways are managing and going very well. And then if we move on to the region Antarctica, which is a very unique situation because all these 7 territorial claimant states agreed to freeze their territorial claims and then they agreed to do scientific cooperation, et cetera, through the 1959 Antarctica Treaty System. And then moving to, for instance, to the South China Sea, it's a very different issue. It's much more complex than the Arctic or Antarctica because we have sovereignty issues among different states. And then we have different principle of whether we are taking equidistant for military delimitation or taking the equitable principle. There's so many issues other than the delimitation, certainly fishing issues, search and rescue, maritime environment. Those are areas that actually we can mobilize further cooperation. So my answer to your question is that we cannot just look at one answer for all this region. We have to take into account of the many regions, their legal clarity, and their also political willingness, and whether they are able to accommodate and adapt to the different interpretation and involvement of the many laws.
So you need to look into the complexity of different questions. That's the difficult part, you know. The world needs simplistic answers and golden one-liners. And when you say for a complex situation, it's quite impossible. But that's what we have to try to do. Finally, Mr. Zhao, you talked about legal ways, you talked about political settlement, you talked about practical cooperation. Is China doing all of these 3 at the same time?
My initial impression is we are in the process in all 3 directions. But as Dr. Hong Nong made reference, I think it's not only about the regional context, it's about the regional reality. Because for certain regions or countries, they are more preferred of so-called the dispute settlement mechanisms underpinned by the UNCLOS, while the nature of their disputes are quite low sensitive, low connected or less connected to the historical background. But our practice here in East Asia or in the South China Sea issue are more complex with the strong and direct impact of both 2 world wars. There is a historical heritage that we should inherit. And I think given that context, China inevitably should consider the multi-layered approaches to address these concerns. I think I fully agree that regional countries, of course, are interested in resolving those problems. But meanwhile, I think we should be more patient and we should really let the regional actors to lead the process, because now it seems to me the biggest challenges is the external factors. The external actors are really trying to take more precise, clear sides on those sovereignty issues and trying to inject the power politics and all those great power rivalry. So I think that could be really endanger the ongoing process of peaceful management of disputes in the region. Thank you.
All right. It's been very interesting. I think every time I revisit this question, we learn something new, and certainly it's a complex issue which needs a lot of wisdom, a lot of political will, and maybe innovative solutions as well to start from where we can. Many thanks to my panel of guests, Professor Hu Bo from Peking University, Philip Saunders from Dalhousie University, Mr. Tolstich from the Russian Academy of Sciences, Professor Harun from the National Defense University of Malaysia, Admiral Singha from India, Hong Nong from the Institute for China-America Studies, and last but not least, Mr. Zhao Long from the China Institutes for International Studies. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Sanya, the beautiful city in South China's Hainan province. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing on behalf of the whole team. Thank you for watching. You've got the point.